Building an army in Warhammer 3 has got to be one of the most complex and daunting tasks, especially if you're a newer player, so allow me to break down a few approaches to army building, but honestly this is such a huge and vast subject that there's certainly going to be more army building philosophies out there than the main four I'm going to detail in this video. So just know you've got a fair bit of freedom to play around with everything I say here. So let's begin with
the balanced build.
So here's a good old traditional balanced early game Empire army, which is essentially trying to mimic a classic ancient real world army composition. And while this is how we've been fighting in previous Total War games like Rome 2 and how they were fighting 2,000 years ago in actual Rome, well, it all still works here even in Warhammer 3. We've got a front line of swordsmen, some spears at the edges to protect against cavalry, we got some missiles to shoot stuff as it comes in, cavalry to protect the flanks and to push on the enemy. Classic. Here's a few examples for other factions with a similar sort of balanced build, but this approach still works pretty damn well. It's very much a jack of all trades, master of none type build, but that makes it incredibly versatile. Here are 5 types of units that I believe any army has to be able to potentially deal with. There is a lot of variables, of course, because we're dealing with 24 different factions and thousands of units, and an AI that likes to build its armies seemingly at random with random unit choices. But these 5 things are the threats you've got to watch out for and that your army needs to be prepared for. So if you're a balanced army, you've got to be able to deal with all these things. So you need the 5 antis, not including Anti-Susan. You need units good for killing infantry, units good for killing armor, whether that's infantry, cavalry, or monsters. Anti-large, so you can deal with cavalry monsters and single entities, lords, heroes. Anti-range, something that's fast, that can get after those missile units and artillery and stop them from firing on you. And anti-air, which is of course dealing with anything that can fly. So this kind of balanced army has that. We have Karl and the Wizard, those are kind of versatile, they could do lots of things. The Priest is for supporting the infantry, we've got anti-large in the Spearmen, we've got anti-infantry in the Swordsmen, anti-armor in the Carroburg Greatswords, anti-air, anti-armor, anti-large in the handgunners and the missiles, and then anti-infantry, anti-range in the cavalry. So we've got all of those 5 bases covered in varying amounts, but now you might be thinking, well, what if an enemy army with lots of heavy armor comes along and you don't have that much anti-armor? Well, let me introduce you to probably the most important word when it comes to playing Total War: adaptability. In the words of our Lord and Savior Sun Tzu, those who are able to adapt and change in accord with the enemy and achieve victory are called divine, yo. So with your army, you need to be able to observe the situation, understand the circumstances, and modify your behavior accordingly. Honestly, this is probably the most important trait when it comes to getting good at Total War, whether in campaign or battles. You've got to know how to make do with what you've got and make it work. Now, in the context of building armies and units, we have to understand one very important thing about units, is that they themselves are pretty damn adaptable. A unit of halberd demigryphs is an anti-large armor-piercing cavalry. They're very good at killing heavily armored monsters and cavalry. That's their main purpose. So when picking targets on the battlefield, they should go for the ones that are best suited to their design, such as these Chaos Knights. They're heavily armored and large. Perfect target, primary target. Chaos Spawn, they're not armored, but they are large, so another primary target for the demigryphs. But they could still target infantry. Although their bonus versus large is kind of going to waste, they could still go after these Forsaken, and that's a good secondary target for them. Or they could go after the ranged units, missiles and artillery. Again, a bit of a waste of their talents because they're very strong. Lesser units could do that job. But then there's these Chaos Warrior halberds, which they need to avoid at all costs. So while units have their optimum primary targets they should go after, they still have the capability to take on other types of units, like in this case infantry or ranged. So it's looking to get those primary targets when it makes sense to, but sometimes going after a secondary target might make more sense. If there's an especially dangerous infantry or an especially dangerous artillery, might be better for the demigryphs to go after them, while still of course trying to avoid that bad matchup at all costs. So just understand that most units have multiple roles and can do multiple things, thus adaptability. Black Orcs are primarily an anti-infantry unit. They've got big armor-piercing damage, but they could also go after cavalry, heavily armored monsters. They could still do good work against those things despite not having a bonus versus large. Kroxagords, they're anti-infantry. They actually have a bonus versus infantry, so they are actively best against infantry. But if a situation arises where you've got some strong cavalry or monstrous infantry or a lord or hero that you need to deal with, they could still deal with those things in the moment if required. It's not their optimum matchup, but they can still do it pretty well. Missile units, especially strong armor-piercing ones like Thunderers, these are the most adaptable units of all because they can take on literally anything. Infantry, cavalry, monsters, lords, heroes, other ranged units, air units. Nearly everything can be a primary target unless it has a shield, but their caveat is of course that they are usually rubbish in melee and will require some protection to be able to use all that ammo. So with a balanced army, you've got to understand that your units have a good amount of adaptability. They can do many different jobs. Ideally, they all want to do their optimum jobs, but that's never going to happen. There's going to be units that have to take their secondary job sometimes, and that's okay. And ultimately, that's what Total War battles break down to. You want to try and get more optimum matchups than the other guy. That's how you win. And you want to avoid those bad matchups. Because if you get too many of those, or you get more of those than the enemy does, then you are going to lose. The key is adaptability of your units, your army, your tactics, your strategy, everything. So anyway, you've got your balanced army and you're ready to go. You want to support that by all the available game mechanics, such as the technology tree. Here I'm taking the infantry buffs and I'm going to take the cavalry buffs after that, because those are the biggest two components of my army. I have the most units of those types, and thus they'll get the most benefit from these techs, and the same with Lord skill points. I'm going to put them into the ones that buff up infantry and cavalry, because that's going to have the most effect on my mostly infantry and cavalry army. And because I'm going to be sticking with this kind of army composition for most of the campaign, these skill points will always be useful, and thus I can put the rest of my skill points into other useful stuff. So with your balanced armor, you'll push out into the world to conquer your enemies, and you can check their armies out before you engage with them and see if you can deal with them. For example, I can look at this Khazrak One-Eye army and see, okay, my infantry can deal with their infantry. I've got the great swords for their bestigors. My cavalry will be able to deal with their dogs and their missiles, and then there's some minotaurs. I've got my anti-large units for that, and my missiles and whatever else might be there. I should be able to deal with this army pretty comfy. A few more examples. Here's some vampires. My infantry should be fine with theirs. I've got the cavalry that can help with that as well if necessary. There's some crypt horrors. I can shoot those. I can get my spears on those. And then a bunch of corpse carts that pretty much anything could beat up. Probably my cavalry, my anti-large units. And then a few question marks, but we should be fine to deal with this. Here's a Greenskins army. This one's a little tougher. They've got a lot of big uns. They're going to beat up my front line pretty easily, so they'll need some support with cavalry from Carl, from Magic. Cav can also run down those missiles, and it might have to deal with some of these squigs and pump wagons, but my anti-large units and missiles will hopefully be able to deal with those. My Cav will need to be careful dealing with the big uns, though, as the big uns are anti-large. They will beat my Cav up. They are the bad matchup for my Cav. But as long as they cycle charge and they don't stay in combat too long, it hopefully will do the job. It's not our ideal solution, but it might be the only one we have. And one more, if we were fighting this Chaos army here, it's got some strong armor-piercing infantry here. We got Caribou greatswords that can deal with that. Carl and Magic could help with that too. Our infantry will do okay fighting their infantry, but they will need help. We can try and soften them up with the missiles and then cycle charge them with the Cav, Hammer and Anvil. Our missiles and anti-large can deal with the Trolls and Giant, and then Cav can deal with the dogs and hopefully whatever else is left. So that, for me at least, is how I approach battles and how I think about them before I go into them. Doing a sort of little auto-resolve in my head. Do I have the tools to deal with those units that they have? And most of the time you will find that a balanced army will have the tools that you need to deal with whatever you run into in some way, as long as your army composition is covering the 5 antis to some degree. If you don't, if you're missing one, let's say, you might find it hard in that area. For example, if this army had no spears or missile units, I might find it hard to deal with the giant or the trolls because I don't have anti-large. Now, is that the end of the world and mean that we're doomed to lose the battle? No, of course not. We just need to get adaptable with our other units. Our swordsmen can still hurt giants after all. They're not going to do a great deal of damage and they're going to die horribly in the process, but they can still do something. As could Carl, as could Magic, as could Cavalry. Not terribly effectively, but they can still do it. And that's the adaptability we're talking about. Total War is really just all about making do with what you've got. Find a way to get the job done with the tools you happen to have brought this day. Maybe you need to hammer a nail into the wall, but then you remember, oh shit, I lent my hammer to Legends Nan, so I'm just going to have to use the spanner to hammer the nail into the wall. It's not the right tool for the job, it's not super effective, but f*** it, it gets the job done. Now, naturally, as you progress through your campaign, you're going to want to make your army stronger as you go, and you can still keep the same kind of formula while upgrading the units. So, for example, when you've got the infrastructure and the economy, you'll be able to replace your handgunners with Nuln Ironsides, a stronger version of the handgunners essentially. You'll be able to replace your swordsmen with all greatswords, making your army much stronger. You can replace the cavalry with a couple of units of Reichsguard and maybe a bunch of halberd demigriffs, perhaps, whatever you like, but you're still keeping the same rough formula here, so all those skill points and tech tree upgrades are still useful here, still relevant, because the army is still staying balanced and mostly in the same sort of composition. Alternatively, you could instead put the money into just building a second army of the same type or a different type, but it might be better to do this if you're facing a faction that has a lot of armies like the Skaven, or maybe you're in multiple wars and you need to be in more than one place. Having two weaker armies might be better than having one stronger one. And that's one of those things with a lot of variables on the situation where one might be better than the other. So this is the balanced approach to army building, and this is probably what I do a lot of the time. It can certainly be very effective, but it does require a lot of knowledge in terms of units and factions, but the only way you're going to learn that is by doing it, and that's what's great about this balanced build, is because you're sticking with the same army, you're going to get to learn it and how to use it. It also comes with the upsides of having the efficient use of your skill points and tech upgrades. It's cheaper because you're not recruiting units all the time, other than when you want to upgrade them. But there is one big downside to this, but we'll talk about this later when we've got some more context. Another downside though is that while our army is nice and balanced and can deal with lots of different threats, it may not be able to take advantage of a specific faction weakness or nullify one of their strengths. So balanced builds often aren't optimal. Let's take the good old dwarfs for example, well known for their heavy armor and resilience. To counter this heavy armor, we'd want to bring lots of armor-piercing units, which our early game balance build doesn't really have. So I might instead tailor-make this army to go and deal with the dwarfs. I've got a front line of halberdiers and the great swords. Halberdiers, they have armor-piercing damage, which is useful, and while they don't have quite as much melee attack as swordsmen, they do have way more melee defense, so they're actually better than swordsmen versus dwarfs, even though they're an anti-large unit. So I go with them for holding a front line and doing a little bit of damage. I've got the Caribou greatswords, who are of course armor-piercing, so they're perfect for the job. Handgunners, they're armor-piercing missiles, so they'll be great for blasting the dwarfs from all directions. If they run after us, we can just run away because they're slow as shit. Also, if there's any gyrocopters or thunder barges, these boys will have them covered. We do have some cavalry, although not armor-piercing. They are primarily anti-range, which is very important against the dwarfs, as they have incredibly strong missiles and artillery. And then some outriders who are armor-piercing, so they can put on the damage, and very mobile, so the dwarfs won't be able to catch them. So with this kind of build, we're aiming to take away the strength of an army, or maybe exploit a weakness, and that is taking us into our second way of building an army with
the counter build.
The driving idea of playing this way is changing your army depending on the enemies that you're facing. So for example, here as Gorbad, I've just been fighting the dwarfs, so I've got a whole lot of armor piercing in my army. But that war is finished up now, and I've now been attacked by the Skaven, who are quite different from the dwarfs. They have a lot of infantry also, but it doesn't have a lot of armor on, and so all that armor piercing isn't really required. Now that army will do fine, but maybe something like this might be more appropriate just for smashing lots of infantry, a bit of cavalry to get after their ranged, and so I've built this army for dealing with the Skaven specifically. And that's just one army build I could throw together for dealing with Skaven. I can probably make 10 more in a similar vein, and they do the job just fine as well. So building an army in this way, we can tailor that army more specifically to the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy faction we're facing. And as those enemies change, as we go in and out of wars with different factions and different races, we can build our armies more optimally to deal with that specific foe, rather than a balanced build where we're trying to make do with what we've got, right? Like I said, with a balanced build, you're trying to make do with the tools that you happen to have brought, whereas with this kind of counter approach, you're making sure you bring the right tools in the first place. That being said, there's still going to be some need to stay adaptable and make do with what you've got, because every enemy army is going to be different. And do remember that not all factions have all kinds of units, so taking it back to the 5 antis, if we were building an army to deal with Kislev, well, they don't really have any flying units, so we don't really need to worry about bringing anti-air. If we're fighting the dwarfs, we don't need to worry about bringing anti-large, because they're all under 4'2". If we're fighting the vampires, we don't need to worry about anti-range, because they don't really have any. So keep these kind of things in mind for whatever build you're making. And while factions have certain strengths and weaknesses and playstyles, there's no saying that the AI is going to adhere to them when building their armies. For example, this Wood Elf army is a very nice balanced army, kind of similar to our Empire one at the start, right? It's got all those 5 components: anti-infantry, anti-large, anti-armor. And here's a bunch of other random AI builds, which are pretty nice to fight, pretty nice and easy to see what's going on with their army and to plan for it. These builds are kind of playing to the strengths of their army and looking how you might expect them to look. For example, the ogres, you expect a lot of large, and look, there's a lot of large. The Dark Elves, one of their strongest components is their armor-piercing missiles. They've got a lot of those. So you might have nicely presented armies like this, or you might get this bullshit, where it looks like the AI has just hit the auto-generate button from multiplayer and has just chosen whatever the fuck it wants with no rhyme or reason. I, for one, personally hate fighting these kind of armies because I know the battle is just going to be an absolute mess. The best you can do is just pick out the unit types. Okay, here's the infantry, here's the large units, here's the ranged units. I gotta try and deal with those components. But why must I fight an army with 19 fucking different units? One thing I do always recommend, however you've decided to build your army, is to use heroes to scout ahead and see what you're up against. What units are in the enemy armies? How many armies are there? This is going to inform your decision on how to tactically build to deal with this specific enemy. And you can do your best to try and counter what they've got, which sometimes might be necessary, because if you run into an army like this, which has 10 frostworms, that's a big strong single entity, you're probably going to need to build specifically to defeat that army. And there's a varying degree of depth you can go into with this kind of building as well, because you could go for something like spamming nasty skulkers against the dwarfs. This is a mild tactical advantage, as nasty skulkers have armor piercing, so good for getting through the dwarf armor, but they also have stalks, so they can't be shot by all the artillery and missiles of the dwarfs before they get to them. So a pretty nice early game greenskins army for dealing with dwarfs, which while it is taking some advantages, right, we're taking away the strength of the dwarven armor, we're taking away the strength of their missiles and artillery a little bit, but they still do have a fair chance of winning the battle. However, what if we build tactically to give them no chance of winning pretty much? Here's some examples. What about an army of dwarf gyrocopters and a couple of thunder barges versus the greenskins? This is nearly untouchable because they don't really have any flying units or any wyverns, which you don't see very often, and their missiles are all bows and not armor piercing, so not great for taking down gyrocopters, and if you focus those and get them off the field first, there's literally nothing the enemy army can do. They just have to sit there and get blasted to death from the sky. Or how about an army of Dark Elf Shades versus the Dwarfs? The Shades have stalks, so they can't be seen by all the missiles and artillery of the Dwarfs. The Shades' missiles are armor-piercing, so they'll hurt everything. The Dwarfs have no mobility to be able to catch all of these Shades, so if they try to run after the Shades can just run away, have a bit of a skirmish. The Dwarfs will never be able to catch them, maybe Slayers if they're lucky, so you can literally just pick them apart. And if you take out the missiles early, there's nothing they can really do. So this kind of build is massively exploiting the dwarf's lack of mobility. What about versus the ogres? And lots of factions can do this, but in this case Empire, you bring a front line of spearmen, or in this case halberdiers, you put a bunch of missiles behind them and then GG. Ogres can't really do anything, because anything dangerous in this army is going to be large, so you just need lots of anti-large, and spears are anti-large, missiles are anti-large. You might have to watch out for their vultures, but other than that, this is a pretty easy win against the ogres, exploiting the fact that most of their army is large and thus pretty easy to counter. Or one more, how about bringing all cavalry as Bretonia versus the Skaven, whose armies are mostly composed of low leadership, cheap, light infantry that can be absolutely mowed down, cycle charged, whatever. The Skaven's lack of reliable anti-large and any cavalry to counter you with means you can just run all over them, run away when you like, and there's not really a damn thing they'll be able to do about it when you cycle charge back into their face 10 times. So we're taking advantage of their lightly armored, no cavalry weaknesses. So you're building these kind of hard counters to whatever strengths or weaknesses the enemy might have. So you might destroy your foes more optimally, more cleanly, but I think it does come with a little more risk that you might end up being countered yourself. For example, if you brought the Bretonia Cav army versus Skaven, well, it's not going to work so well if they happen to have brought an army of Storm Vermin, which are all anti-large infantry, compared to, say, a balanced build which would be able to deal with your normal typical Skaven army, but also deal with an army of Storm Vermin. A couple of other downsides to this kind of building is that it's going to be more time-consuming recruiting units, it's going to be more expensive having to pay for recruitment costs, although you might be able to get some reductions to those with buffs and techs. It's also going to be a waste of experience and ranks your units have gained. If you want to recruit a new unit to build a new army but you can't afford to keep the old one, well, you're going to have to disband them, and that's a bit wasteful. And it's going to be a little more difficult if you've taken all the skill points in your infantry and cavalry, but now you want to make a missile army, well then you're going to need the Lord skill points in the missiles to make them stronger as well. So it's a little bit more faff, but with some potentially big gains. So that's two ways of approaching army building. On to the third, which is maybe kind of a mix of these previous two.
Thematic.
So this is when you build an army around a certain type of unit or units just because you think they're zogging cool, or that it could be a fun challenge. For example, I'm a greenskins man and I love a good savage orc, so making savage orc armies and running with only those for the entire campaign is my want of an afternoon. Now this does kind of pigeonhole me into the legendary Lord Wurzag because he's got a lot of buffs for savage orcs, so he makes the most sense to do this with. But you can still kind of play as a blend of either having a balanced build and trying to fill those 5 antis as much as savage orc units can, or you can make a kind of counter build. If you run into a certain faction, you can build specifically to destroy them in a certain way. And I've done a fair few of these for my campaign videos, doing different kind of challenges using only certain kinds of units. And then you do, as I mentioned with the balance build, you take all the possible means to buff those units up, from lord skill points, tech trees, items, whatever. I've done Karl Franz campaigns with only cavalry using ancient Mongol tactics. I've conquered all of China with only crocodiles. There's a sentence I never thought I'd say. I tried to play the Skaven as if they were dwarfs and tried to play the dwarfs as if they were pyromancers using only fire units. There's definitely a lot of fun to be had just playing with units that you think are cool or in some way that you think is cool, whilst mostly applying everything I said in the first 2 builds, balanced and counter. So with that, let's move on to our final build, which I think some of you might know what's coming.
Doomstacks.
A Doomstack is typically when you fill your army with a single unit or a certain type of unit. As with this case, it's all Minotaurs, and that brings a hell of a lot of large to an enemy army. So unless the enemy army is composed of all strong anti-large units, they're not going to be able to stop this. It's just too much of one thing. So you have those units that are strong enough in their own right, but then you buff them up with all the red line skill points available, and if you do it with a certain legendary lord that might have a certain bunch of unique skills, as Taurox does here, you can buff them up even further. He gives melee defense with Herd Lord, he gives regeneration and a damage boost with Gore Feast, and then there's a bunch of tech tree upgrades as well, of course, to buff up Minotaurs. So you're just stacking all these buffs on top of each other. There's some unique mechanics which you can get buffs with as well, so you can just make the army absolutely disgusting. And what you end up with is an army that can pretty much 1v1 any other army on the campaign map and crush them easily. Perhaps allowing them to take on multiple armies in a single turn or multiple armies at the same time, 2 or 3 stacks, and crushing them, whether that has to be in auto-resolve or fighting the battle. Now, the upside of this is that it makes it really easy to win your battles, but the downside is that it makes it really easy to win your battles, and that could be quite boring if you actually want to play some fun battles. Something like the Minotaurs is a little bit more fun because you have the different types of Minotaurs. You got ones with shields, normal ones, and anti-large ones, so there's some getting the matchups right there, and it's not just a case of right-clicking everything once and calling GG. So building this way, it can be fun in the short term, or if you're playing on higher difficulties like Legendary, this can be very useful because you will get a lot of armies you'll have to deal with, so being able to churn through them quickly is actually quite an asset. It is generally regarded as being a cheesy strategy because it can be very overpowered. Like here, I'm about to defeat 3 stacks with 1 stack of Hellblasters, and then I've got enough juice left on the next turn to go and attack a settlement with a big garrison in it, and decisive victory that too. So if you take any tier 4 or 5 unit and do this, it can be pretty strong. But you can do it with lesser units. Some of you might remember my Ghost campaign I did as Heinrich Kemmler, as he gets some nice buffs for Ghost units. These are tier 2 and 3 units, so not that strong. But when you rank them up, you give them all the buffs, they can become pretty formidable. It's not going to be quite as powerful as a Minotaur Doomstack probably, or a Hellblaster Doomstack, but still pretty strong and a bit more fun because it's not so strong. But you're still very often overwhelming the enemy with a single type of unit. And that brings us to the big weakness of the balanced armies I mentioned earlier. It is, of course, Doomstacks. Essentially, if the AI should bring a lot of the same type of unit, it's going to be difficult for a balanced army to deal with. This is literally the strongest balanced Empire army I could think of, and I've got it facing only 12 Kemrian War Sphinxes, not even 19 that you could potentially see in campaign, or 20 I guess, as Tomb King Lords can get this mount. But there is just no tactics or anything that you can pull here to be able to defeat this, even though I've got like 5 units of Halberd Demigryphs, 3 units of Nuln Ironsides, the Hammer of the Witches artillery. There's just too much big single entity large that we can't keep a hold of, and they can just run all over us. To defeat this, I'd have to make a counter build, so if I saw this coming, I would probably make something like this, where it's just all Demigryph Halberds and then a bunch of Nuln Ironsides. That's it. Just tons of anti-large, and with that, our Demigryphs will mostly hold back the Kemrians, while the Nuln Ironsides blast them to bits, and this is a pretty easy victory for my counter army. So Doomstacks are a viable way to play, but they're taking things to the extreme. So it's up to you whether you find the idea of doing that fun or not. A lot of Total War's fun as you get better at the game does come from self-imposed rules, not allowing yourself to build armies like that. But no one can deny it's pretty fun at least a few times to watch 19 Dreadsaurians stomp all over some elves, yes! So those are the main 4 approaches to building an army in Total War Warhammer 3, in my incredible opinion. But do understand, you don't have to pick one of these and just run with it for your entire campaign. You can mix and match and do whatever you like. Maybe your first army will be a balanced one, and then your second army you'll make a counter army because of a certain faction you're facing, and then, oh scheisse, Archaon's coming with 10 stacks, so we need to get rid of those quickly. Maybe it's time for a Doomstack. Or you could try self-imposed rules and try to succeed in a campaign with just balanced armies. Like I said at the start, there's a lot of freedom with this, a lot of flexibility, so experiment and see what you like. And finally, let's just finish up on a few little things to think about when building an army.
Ranged protection.
So I think it's a pretty common thing, especially with newer players, to bring a lot of ranged units. Whether that's missiles or artillery, you bring like half an army or 2/3 of an army of ranged units, with but a few melee infantries in front of them protecting them. This is not enough protection for this amount of missile units, and what you're going to find is you are going to struggle to protect all your missile units and keep them firing. Because there's a lot of ways to get after missiles in this game. You've got dogs, you've got cavalry, you've got flyers, you've got magic, you've got summons. It can be pretty tough to even keep a few missile units firing for an entire battle and using up all of their ammo. Because you see, perhaps a little known fact about missile units is that if men die in a missile unit, their ammo goes with them. So if you lose half the men in your unit, you've lost half of your unit's ammo. Even if the bar is still showing full, it's relative to the amount of men you've got left. So only bring the amount of ranged units, whether that's missiles or artillery, that you can protect. If you want a rough guideline, I'd say bring 2 units that are capable of protecting a missile unit for every 1 missile unit you bring. So if we've got 3 units of Streltsy missiles, we're going to want 6 units to protect them. That could be a bunch of infantry, 4 frontline units, 2 on the edge. That's the minimum. Obviously, the more the better, but that's probably a good minimum to aim for. Like I mentioned earlier, missiles are very often the strongest part of an army because they can deal with everything. They are anti-everything. But if you can't protect them enough to use all of their ammo, then you might as well just bring something else. Think of it this way. What's better, bringing 3 missile units and getting to use all of their ammunition, or bringing 6 missile units and only getting to use half of all their ammunition? Well, you're going to have used the same amount of ammunition, except you took up 3 extra slots in your army that you could have brought some other units with. Melee, infantry, cavalry, whatever. If you're not using your ammo because the missiles got disrupted or the men died, that's a big waste of that unit's potential. And is also hurting the army because you could have brought 3 other units in their place. In any ideal situation, you want to use all of a missile unit's ammo and then chuck them into melee. In the case of Streltsy, they're actually kind of good in melee, so they work out pretty well if you do that. Most won't, but you get the idea. Only bring as much ranged as you can protect.
Consider auto-resolve.
Now what I mean by this is consider whether you want to auto-resolve a lot of battles or fight more battles. Because if you're somebody that doesn't really enjoy the battles of Total War and you'd just rather auto-resolve your way through them, well then you might want to disregard everything I just said about protecting missiles, and you'll want to bring more missiles in your army. Because you see, auto-resolve is a little simulation of a battle, and in that simulation, the game assumes that the missile units and artillery gets to use all of their ammunition, which realistically in a battle, they won't. So ranged units do hold a bit of extra weight when it comes to auto-resolving. You might be a bit more likely to get a better result with more missile units, although it will depend on the missile units. Obviously, goblin archers aren't going to be as great as handgunners or anything. So yeah, something to keep in mind if you would rather auto-resolve, but of course be aware that if you do have to fight a battle, you might find it a struggle to protect all your missiles. Next.
Mobility is king.
So what do I mean by mobility first of all? Well, anything with a bit of speed, pretty much. That could mean many types of units, lords and heroes, whether on mounts or on foot if they've got a good foot speed, single entity monsters that are quick, monstrous infantry, but perhaps namely cavalry and flying units. These are the most mobile, the quickest units on the battlefield. And with speed comes some pretty powerful advantages. For example, let's say there's a unit of Saurus Warrior Shields and a unit of Cold One Riders, but oh scheisse, bad matchups are coming their way. Some Phoenix Guard will absolutely mess up the Cold One Riders, and some Homemasters of Sordith will destroy the Saurus. These are terrible matchups for these 2 units, but the Cold Ones have the luxury of mobility and being able to just run away from their bad matchup. Whereas the Saurus, they're a little slower than the Homemasters, so they are going to be caught and they are going to be slowly killed off as they run away. Infantry does not have the luxury of mobility, bar a few units like Witch Elves that are very quick. So that's one main advantage. The other one is their ability to simply change what they're doing very quickly. They might be doing one thing, but then they'll see some friendly units in trouble, like some Saurus being beat up by Homemasters, and they can run over there pretty quick and help out. So mobility affords you the ability to be able to get in and out of situations very quickly, and in battle where time is money, friend, points if you know where that quote comes from, being able to get over to a friendly unit and help them out quickly is going to save their life. I'd say a good average to aim for in your army building is maybe like 30 to 50% mobility. This gives you a lot of power to be able to change your situations much quicker than if your army was mostly infantry. For example, with Norska versus Tzeentch here, there's some Doom Knights over here, a very strong flying cavalry. The Lord is also coming over, some Cavs also coming over, so a bunch of strong units are heading to the right side of my army, where I've got a fair amount of units that can deal with those, but they could always use a bit of extra help. So I'm going to bring my 3 Manticores over, who are literally on the other side of the map, on the other side of my army. They've got 85 speed, so it won't take them much time to get over here at all. I'm also going to bring Throg down here. And all of this was able to get over here pretty quickly and work together to take down these enemy units. And now we can see the rest of the enemy army is approaching. There's a bunch of pink horrors here. Those can be some pretty dangerous missiles. I can send a Manticore over there because he's quick, he's got mobility. He can go and disrupt them and stop them from firing until some other stuff can get over there and help. And then, oh, there's some more pink horrors on the other side of the map behind the front line. I can send a Manticore over there to get them. My Skin Wolves are nice and quick. They flanked around to help the front line now. These units have that mobility, which helps their adaptability, shall we say. More pink horrors at the back here. Another Manticore going after that. Some Doggos nice and quick. Gonna get after them as well. So you can see how much more adaptable mobility can be than just infantry. So yeah, make sure you recruit yourself a fair amount of mobility units. Your infantry is generally a bit better for holding things in place, while the mobility moves around it and tries to destroy everything. That's like a rough guideline of how battles generally often work.
Simple.
And my last tip of the day is don't be afraid to keep army building simple. Just have a few types of units if you want. 3 or 4 is probably fine. As long as you can cover most of those 5 antis, then you'll probably do okay. You might have to be a little careful, like this Empire army, for example, maybe lacks a little in the anti-armor, but we're adaptable. We can probably find a way to deal with armor, or at least some armor, if we have to. Maybe not a full army of heavy dwarfs, but yeah, don't feel like you need to bring loads of different units, right? Because I could bring an army like this, and I know exactly what I want to do with all of these units against a certain enemy I'm fighting. I know how to use all these unique regiments of renown and all this stuff, but if you're new to the game, you're not going to know how to use that, so don't worry too much about them. Until you get better, until you understand a bit more, then you can start to make your armies a little bit more complex. Because hey, Doomstacks are the strongest armies in the game, and they're very often just a single type of unit. And if you only bring 3 or 4 units in your army, it's a lot easier to manage when playing battles as well. Because yes, while you'll still need to worry about the matchups that you get to get the optimum ones and the best secondary ones and not get the bad ones, it's much easier to see what's going on with your units and see what those matchups are if you have a lot of the same units. So there we go. I think the main 4 approaches to army building, and a lot of things to think about. Like I said, this is a very complex subject. It does take a fair old while to take it all in, but just get into it, absorb yourself in it, and you will slowly but surely learn. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, consider checking out YouTube memberships or Patreon. I am trying to do no integrated ads this year, so you will see no random ads in the middle of videos, for this year at least, while I experiment with this. I'm trying to gather more funding from viewers rather than from random advertisers. That's the idea anyway. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.